Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. This is Craig from Acid Horizon, and today we're just going to jump right into today's discussion with Grafton Tanner. However, this is a two-parter, and the last 25 to 30 minutes or so are on our Patreon account for our Patreon subscribers. When you subscribe, you get to hear other exclusive conversations, such as the one that we recently had with Meredith Graves, or Ross Wolf, or Emma Stam. And you'll get to take advantage of the reading groups that we have coming down the pike in 2026. Okay, let's get into today's discussion with our friend Grafton Tanner. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the theory podcast. Now, usually when I kick off an episode, I begin with a handful of provocative questions to set the stakes of the conversation. But today we're going to do things a little differently. And that's for a few reasons. One is that our guest, Grafton Tanner, is not only a formidable thinker and writer, but a friend, someone whose presence has intersected with our work in meaningful and almost fateful ways in the past. When we first took over the Zero Repeater YouTube channel back in 2021, I think, he was one of the first authors we reached out to, and one of the first who stepped in to generously help us out and find our footing at the imprint. And long before that, when I was first encountering the Repeater imprint over a decade ago, Grafton's work was among the first that caught my attention and left a deep impression on me. And then, fast forward to March of this year, when he joined us once again on the front lines, this time as part of our boycott of Watkins Media and all of its imprints after workers' efforts to speak openly about the ongoing genocide in Palestine were suppressed. And just as serendipitously, he appeared at the launch of the AHRC, delivering a brilliant first class on the politics of nostalgia, sessions that I had the pleasure of attending and genuinely enjoyed. Those recordings will soon be available on our website, along with the new offerings for 2026, including our upcoming Patreon reading group on Deleuze's Logic of Sense, so look for that. But before we go any further, I want to flag something clearly for listeners. We're going to talk about Grafton's book, Purging the Devil, but I also want to reiterate that we continue to support the boycott of Watkins Media, which means Zero Books, Repeater Books, and their other imprints. So while we're casting a spotlight on Grafton's work today, this is not an endorsement of the imprint itself. Our focus is on the ideas, the research, and the author himself. And Grafton, you're welcome to share your own thoughts about that situation. And so before we dive in, would you like to say anything at the outset?
Well, first, thanks for having me on. And yes, that's been my goal as well over the last several months, is to talk about some of the ideas in this book. But yeah, I firmly support the boycott Watkins movement and have been in communication with those folks. And I'll just tell you, it's as an author, and some other authors associated with Repeater and Zero can probably attest this as well, which is that it's been a difficult year having to watch the publisher you've worked with for so long, endorse some ideas you firmly don't believe in.
Yeah, and we'll get to talking a little bit about that behind the scenes in our For Patrons Only discussion, which will follow this. But let's turn to the book, Your Ideas, Purging the Devil, an apt title of sorts for the totality of today's topics. It appears at a first glance to be a history of exorcism, both in terms of the literal rituals that have haunted the West and the metaphorical ones that structured the Cold War, the culture wars, and the ideological panics of our present. But at its core, this book seems to be about belief, vulnerability, and the frightening ease with which institutions, families, and whole societies decide who is possessed, who must be purified, and what forms of violence are they willing to justify in the name of deliverance. And I had a nice look at this book over the past 2 days, and I love the first chapter in particular. And I was hoping actually you could start off with that, because I think the stories themselves really do a lot of the work that you're attempting to do in the book. And so could you talk to us about Annalisa Meikle? Why did you begin the project of Purging the Devil with this story, and how does her story illuminate things like suffering, collective suffering, authority structures, and how does that particular story shape our understanding of what we know to be possession or spirit possession?
Well, yeah, the story of Annalise and her possession, which most English-speaking people, I imagine, would know of her through the film adaptation, The Exorcism of Emily Rose, which is, I don't know if I would call it a faithful retelling of what really happened. We're not totally sure what really happened with Annalise in the 1970s, but what we do know was that she and those around her firmly believed that she was possessed, and she asked for exorcism and endured many, many months of exorcism and eventually died at the age of, I believe, 23 after several of those exorcism attempts to everyone involved seemed to be unsuccessful at purging her of the demons that were possessing her. I really became obsessed with this story, like so many others, and it ended up kind of being the central structure around which the book's arguments were created, because there's a lot of things that intersect in the Annalise story, which is belief in spirit possession, the role of science in sussing out what's going on when a person perhaps thinks that they're possessed and wants to be rid of that feeling and be rid of the demons plaguing them. But then I also kind of became weirdly obsessed with the attempts at trying to figure out what quote unquote really happened with Annalise. And so I read some of these writings about her, some of which were done by researchers who were kind of, applying sort of a psychological or sociological lens to the tale. But basically, the short of it is, I don't want to give too much away so people read the book. The book does open with this story of Annalise Michel, who was graduating high school, going into college, believed to be possessed, ended up having to move back home after a stint in a sanatorium to try to figure out what was wrong with her, and then moved back home, asked for exorcism, was granted exorcism by the local clergy. She endured that ritual for quite a long time, several months, maybe even a year. I can't quite remember exactly the length of time. But then at the end of it all, her weight dropped. She stopped eating food. And next thing you know, she died at the age of 23. And there were legal proceedings that happened afterwards, and maybe a little courtroom drama to figure out who was responsible for her death. And it just opened up a lot of questions, a modern, quote unquote, exorcism, and why that might have happened in a time in which science had supposedly taken over the arbiter of diagnosis and sickness in our time. How could something like this have happened, and what might that tell us about our society?
Well, I have to say, while at some level I think I'm a staunch materialist, I am an incontinent one. I actually do want to believe in spirits and exorcism and that sort of thing. But in the book, you talk about her experience as being a kind of human event. It's not reducible to demons or medicine or fraud necessarily. There's a multiplicity or an agglomeration of factors that bring to bear on a situation like that. And I was hoping that you could just, in a very broad stroke, talk about exorcism, spirit possession, historically speaking, and what do you think is happening there? What have we learned about the human condition through these cases? What is it that we still haven't fully processed? And maybe why is it the case that things like this continue to persist in our world today?
That's a great question. And we could talk a long time about that, because I think you're going to get a different answer depending on who you ask. If you ask a historian of exorcism what's really going on, they may have a different answer than obviously a person like a religious person who believes in the materiality and reality of demons. That's not to say the historian of exorcism might not, but they just may have different tools to answer that question. There's a few different theories. And I think one of my goals in the book was kind of maybe to problematize some of the two big theories that we have in our time right now about what possession really is. But I would imagine that most people fall into one or two camps here in terms of explaining what's going on with possession. You've got some folks who think that this is just misdiagnosed mental health disorders, and that's how it's always been. You have folks who are suffering from depression or anxiety or a number of other illnesses, maybe even schizophrenia or epilepsy, and have historically been given the wrong diagnosis without the scientific tools to determine what was really going on with them under a microscope, if you will, looking at a brain. They had their own theories at hand, and one of those might have been demonic possession, depending on the culture in history. Plenty of people still feel that way today. But then you have the other category that's perhaps most common to fall into today, which would be that people firmly believe that demons do exist, that they intervene in the world, they can and do take people over, their personality, maybe they take over their entire body. Maybe there's some range here or spectrum to the degree to which a demon may interfere in a person's life. It's like Linda Blair in The Exorcist is on one end, like that representation, and maybe the other end is perhaps something that's not so extreme. And those folks really do believe in a demonic reality. And my goal in the book was to say, like, both of these are still theories. They have explanatory power depending on your religious beliefs or the culture that you happen to live in. And even though the book itself is firmly about exorcism in a Western context, you have exorcism type practices all over the world in which people do fall into that latter category. They do firmly believe in the reality of demons, and exorcism and possession is a part of their life. What I wanted to do was kind of problematize those theories and maybe draw on some theories that didn't fall into those two categories. And there actually is one fairly common theory that historians of exorcism like to refer to a lot, which is they kind of see exorcism as kind of a theatrical event. So it's something in which everybody involved firmly believes that what's happening is really happening. And then they kind of play these roles, like the exorcist plays a role and the possessed person plays a role too. And it's not like the whole time they know I'm playing a part, I'm performing. The performance is the reality to them, just as we might perform like our gender or the job that we have, the profession we have. We truly and firmly believe we are these things, and so therefore perform them. But it is kind of like a theater performance, if you will. We all have scripts that we follow. And so that's one very common theory of exorcism that I refer to in the book. And so, yeah, that is itself a very human thing to do, to perform that which we believe. It just so happens that like a lot of it all sounds fine and good. Oh, that's such a great theory, right? But like things do go wrong and people do die, like Annalise, or people are kind of smuggled into the performance against their will or without consent. That can create a host of issues as well.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think I really enjoyed that you point out in the book as well is, particularly when talking about the movie The Exorcist, is how many people get injured on the set of The Exorcist. For example, Linda Blair having like back problems for the rest of her life based on the sort of thing she was thrust into to perform possession. And then the director, William Friedkin, blames it on demonic forces interacting with it. And I guess insofar as possession is a kind of a theatrical or narrative response, I mean, I gotta ask, what do you think the relation is between possession and property? Because it's almost like sometimes when we talk about possession, particularly as this sort of narrative structure comes back in certain kinds of like reactionary discourses, anti-communist discourses. I mean, I was also thinking a lot about your book, The Hours Have Lost Their Clock, when you talk about nostalgia being seen as an illness. And this actually reoccurring in the so-called phenomenon of drapetomania that you point out, runaway slave syndrome. This is treated as if, and it is as if to the slave owner, your property has become possessed. The thing that you possess has become possessed and therefore has like an alien will piloting it. And so I asked what you thought about possession and property. And even in terms of, when you give the example as well of the notorious transphobic scum Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage, it's like, this is affecting our children. And of course, children are treated as property. Is there a reason why children tend to get possessed more? Because we're already narrativizing them into a property relation of possession.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think that's right on the money. And yeah, I don't know why I'm so interested in these kinds of ideas. And I think it's got something to do with like other people seem to think, the people in our lives, especially like quote unquote authority figures like parents over children or parents over children that aren't their own, the ones who are like, think of the children, everybody's children, not just mine. They do kind of lay some claim or authority or ownership over people that are seen to them as being, I guess, possessible or ownable. And so when they start to act differently than expected, then suddenly there's this, I don't know, they take offense maybe in some way. And yeah, I'm very much interested in this because we have people who have the fear of possession regarding themselves because they perhaps fear losing control. And in some ways, like if there's any link between this book and perhaps some earlier writings I've done on emotion and in particular the emotion nostalgia, I am really interested in the role that emotion plays in our daily behavior. How in some ways, sometimes the emotions are so strong, they do seem to take a person over. And that can freak a lot of people out, including people who know you well. And they're like, wow, they just had an angry outburst. That's not them. It is them. They're a human being, and anger sometimes can ratchet up pretty quickly. Same with nostalgia. And again, like behavior that is strange and unexpected. And, each of us is creating schemata for the people in our lives, the models in our head. When they don't act according to those models, we start to question what's going on. And for the people who are interested in having or believing they have some ownership over others, like parents over their kids, this is an incredible affront to them. When in fact, something that comes up in the book a couple times is that younger people are going to experiment with all kinds of forms of behavior as they go through the years, even when they become an adult. Sometimes for parents, it can be hard to allow that to happen without immediately rushing to, wait a minute, that's not my kid. So yeah, I think that's really interesting as well. There's a control aspect, fear of losing control of yourself and of others, and definitely like an offense to those types of like asymmetrical relationships, parent child, teacher student, and then historically, like slave owner and enslaved person, definitely.
One of the things I also appreciate is when you bring up the origin of exorcism, which really surprised me. It's like it comes from this idea of oath swearing. And I kept thinking about the album by Merciful Fate called Don't Break the Oath. And I was like, oh, did they know about the etymology of the word exorcism? Because it's like saying that like an oath, to be called to exorcism is to be basically purified by a priest into like retaining like an oath of loyalty to a certain version of that self. And it's almost like it's almost like there's contract law in a way. It's almost like, I'm not going to go to full Adorno on this and be like, you see, it's an ephemeral cultural effect of certain capitalist relations, like these alienated forms become alienated powers. And especially as well when in your analysis of one of my favorite movies of all time, so it was a joy to see it, which is The Devils by Ken Russell, which is just, Oliver Reed is so sexy, he threatens French nationalism, and we have to invent a satanic panic to get rid of him.
Yes. Yeah, The Devils is, I saw it in preparation to write this book, and just the most incredible film that I had seen in a long time, and was really interested in it, reading it as what it's about and what it might say politically, and also how it related to something so successful like The Exorcist, and why one tended to become the greatest horror film of all time, and one has been censored over and over again by Warner Brothers. So yeah, glad to hear that you like that.
I just wanted to ask a little bit about the explicitly political dimension, not only exorcism and spirit possession, but maybe what we could call the politics of paroxysm, where, maybe just to go right to the particular, I came of age in a time when things like faith healing and TV ministries and maybe even online ministries were burgeoning, and Benny Hinn was on every Saturday slapping people with a sport coat, healing them of, liver cancer or whatever it is that they had. And I grew up in a community and kind of on the cusp of the metropolis in rural Pennsylvania, where there was just an absolute swarm of various like Protestant and evangelical religions, many of which took on or practiced forms of like being slain in the spirit, as they say, or faith healing or what have you. And I would say that those incipient experiences for young people and continued belief in them creates a kind of collective belief in a numinous or a beyond, connected with priestly authority, certain values about community and so forth, that is libidinally powerful and energizes a lot of right-wing movements today. And a lot of us who are progressives and radicals, maybe we've navigated away from that because either we were skeptical or completely disbelieved it, thought it was hocus pocus, and then we became materialists and so forth. But clearly there is some sort of power, like social power within the community of what I'm calling the politics of paroxysm. How do you think that figures more definitively into the political dimension of it? And I guess another question I would tack on the end of that is, we've seen cults and what have you like come up in the late 60s, early 1970s. There seems to be like decades or seasons for this sort of thing. And of course, they have a life cycle, right? Who knows what the half-life of Trump's politics are going to look like. But given we live in a deeply reactionary time, we might see an end to this or a tapering off of it. What does that look like against the research that you looked at for this book?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that there are kind of life cycles or boom and bust cycles when it comes to things like cults, the rhetoric of cults, and how their popularity and like in the popular imagination showing up in movies, documentaries and such. And in the 1970s, cults were seen as just like enemies from within, you know what I mean? Infiltrating. Many of the people who were most afraid of cults were these right-wing evangelical folks, although you definitely had plenty of people who were centrist, center-left folks who were seeing cults interrupting the career path or the life path of some of their younger Ivy League educated children. We can definitely talk about this. But there is sort of a life cycle to it. And I do, I don't exactly know what causes these to be talked about again, but I do know this is really great book. It's called We Believe the Children. And I think the writer's last name is Beck, and forgive me, it's cited in the book. I think it's Richard Beck, but I have to double check. But one of the things you write, the book is itself about the Satanic Panic in the 1980s, the McMartin preschool trial, all this stuff. And in the book, he says, look, the craziest thing about writing this book was how many people had not really heard about the Satanic Panic, didn't know it, like didn't grow up with it. And so never really encountered it. Once it kind of died down, it was almost like the American culture especially just kind of went, let's just forget about all of that. That was kind of an embarrassing thing that happened. Let's not ever talk about it again. Now, remnants of it, and it showed, those kind of get passed down, and the rhetoric of like groups of satanic people at the top, cabals of politicians engaging in satanic pedophilia rituals and things like that, that still gets talked about to some extent. But some of these like historical events that are not that old, in which people really, people went nuts about some of this stuff with the Satanic Panic. And, it really affected some of these, again, these right-wing evangelical folks who really believed that what was happening to young children was more than just sexual assault or abuse, but was actually like perhaps demon inflected, like almost like Rosemary's Baby-esque. Some of them truly believed in that. And then it doesn't quite, you maybe get talked about or taught enough in the schools or something. But I do think there's something interesting about that he writes in that book, that the issues that the Satanic Panic brought up then, they haven't really gone away. And in some way, that's the reason why it's not talked about as much today or referenced as something as crazy as it really was when it happened. But it does seem to, I don't know, I kind of think about it in terms of the UFO conspiracy thing that comes and goes throughout history since the beginning of the Cold War. And it has something to do with maybe a general breakdown in mass perception or whatever, or like maybe there's, and I'm just kind of speculating here, but like perhaps like in moments when the general perception of a country or a culture starts to shift and things get a little malleable and weird, suddenly now conspiracies are possible. And then maybe when things lock back into place more, then maybe they don't think about it as much. But it is interesting to see, like 10 years ago, I can't imagine ever writing this book or having people interested in it. But in the 70s or today, it's definitely something that people are drawn to.
Growing up in the 1990s, I still felt some of that, like I said, in the kind of community that I lived in. I can remember a day, in fact, when my mom was in the living room and she warned me explicitly against the dangers of Dungeons and Dragons, heavy metal, and communism. And man, I loved all those things. They're fantastic. And actually, I had a really good, sweet friend, and I still keep in touch with him, who's actually a Jehovah's Witness, or at least he was growing up. I was like his only, I guess you would say, secular, kind of out there, non-Christian friend, or at least somebody who's thinking against the grain. One of the things that they have to do is they have to witness to folks. So he passed me this really elegantly bound red book, and it was basically a screed against philosophy. And you opened it up, and on the first page, there are 3 pictures. First was Karl Marx, second was Friedrich Nietzsche, and the next was Sigmund Freud. And I was like, that's the plan. There it is. That's the syllabus, folks. And welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. That was my reality growing up. But the thing that you talk about in the book, too, is that communist piece is woven in there, the far left piece, right? And so, especially during the Cold War, it was seen as a kind of possession, a kind of contagious force. And one might argue in the conquest of the 1990s, for example, where communism was no more, the specter still lingered. It was there in my reality as well. But I was hoping that you could talk about that a little bit. Like, what role does possession play against the ideologies of Western capitalism and global communism? How does that factor into the dynamics that you discuss in the book?
Yeah, one of the arguments I make in the book is you really don't have a renewed interest in possession and exorcism in the post-war period during the Cold War, you don't really have a renewed interest in that without that specter of communism being discussed in politics and in media. Because one of the things that exorcism scholars will tell you and historians will tell you is that prior to like mid 20th century, early 20th century, 19th century, possession and exorcism, these are topics that people on the ground may or may not endorse or believe in, but that the clergy and the state were not very much interested in, as opposed to like the early modern period in which it was definitely something that a lot of people were talking about and interested in. And it's sort of over time, these big public exorcisms of the early modern period became kind of like threats to law and order and peace or whatever in the eyes of the state. And so then it kind of goes underground, becomes dormant. And then, it's like mid 20th century, people start to get interested in it again. There have been some writers who have argued that the Exorcist novel and movie, the Blatty novel and the William Friedkin movie, that those are the reasons why people got interested in exorcism again. And to me, I think that's kind of an insufficient explanation. And for me, one of the main reasons why are discussed so much again, or people are interested in it or afraid of it or might endorse it as a practice, is because there is this fear coming out of World War II that perhaps there could be another country like maybe the Soviet Union that could, like Nazi Germany, mobilize a large group of people to believe and endorse things and behave in ways that the American public are very concerned about. Okay. So there's a lot of research suddenly in like how communication works and how to persuade a nation and like 9 easy steps. Like, how do you do that? And of course, you have the CIA very much interested in this as well at the time. And so really, to me, like you don't really have the term brainwashing entering into the public lexicon right around World War II, definitely post-war, which was itself a term that had communist connotations. The idea is that like the Soviet Union or China could develop the atomic bomb equivalent of brainwashing, in which suddenly now the entire American public is interested in communism. The leaders become brainwashed. And next thing you know, it's a red world or something. Okay. And so, it's a very easy transition then for some of the evangelicals of that time some of them jumped on the brainwashing bandwagon. Some of them used terms like possession. And then, of course, the Exorcist movie and novel definitely helped as well. But the public was already primed. In 1973, when The Exorcist came out in theaters, the American public especially was already primed for something like that because they had been thinking a bit about American freedom and unfreedom. But to what extent am I'm walking around living my life as an American? To what extent am I vulnerable to this enemy from within or without influence that can get in my head? And suddenly now I'm an unthinking automaton and I'm, a communist robot or what have you. So I got to read a number of, I might even call them absurd books about the connections between Marxism and Satanism that were coming out in the 60s, 70s, and even in the 80s.
Oh, make sure to get us a reading list for the show notes on that.
If you go to the notes section of the book, I had so many of them up on my shelf. Like Marx and Satan is one that you've got to read. Richard Wurmbrand. It's wild.
It's interesting as well. Also thinking about The Exorcist comes around at a very similar time as another big trend in horror culture, I guess, which is the zombie. There's always an interesting dynamic that it seems like the figure of the possessed is always very much individualized. If you have a movie with mass possessions, it becomes a zombie movie. With something sitting on that intersection being something like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is about communism. Like, it's more or less just straight up, it's about communism. And in terms of the narratives of exorcism and possession, it does seem to be, as you're saying, this loss of control, this breakdown in consensus reality and social trust. And of course, the term zombie is Haitian. It comes from this kind of fear of this very often racialized other, and there's also very sexualized other in the case of exorcisms. I mean, the devils and the exorcists and the constant theories of satanic ritual abuse being very much hypersexualized, especially insofar as, children are seen as property. Is the current wave conspiracism, in a way, a hyper version of this exorcism narrative? Because it's kind of hard not to think about Jeffrey Epstein at this point. Come on. It's kind of hard not to. And it's this idea of this QAnon thing. There's these Marjorie Taylor Greene talking about stupid Jewish space lasers and satanic forces, and this entire edifice of conspiracy and mythological narrative. And the emails get released. And yes, there was a series of possessions. It was women and girls being treated like property. And there was a possession there. But the mythological dimension, the imaginative dimension, if anything, is kind of brought up, it's kind of in a way layered on top of it so as to not accept the basic operation of what was gone on, which is people being reduced to things, people being reduced to property. And I just wanted to ask, do you think sort of the narrative impulse of exorcism is a way of kind of retreating into the image to retain a kind of sense of autonomy? Because at least in the realm of the symbol, you can have someone like a priest, and you talk about in the book about how the priest, Father Merrin in The Exorcist, is not a typical exorcist. He's depicted as this philosopher, intellectual, this figure of knowledge. Is the narrative of exorcism kind of a retreat to the realm of knowledge and of images against, in a way, a complete lack of autonomy to understand social change and the like? Because, I mean, it's also a literary culture. You said you read so many books about Marx and Satan and possession. It is a literary, in many senses, and a narrative response to not understanding, I don't know, Skibbity Toilet or something. You know, it is that level of cultural alienation of an older generation.
Mm-hmm. It is a literary genre, and in some weird way, if you want to have proof that the fictional and the literary have completely blurred with the real, then do research on exorcism and possession, because so many of these books that are arguing the very same conspiratorial stuff that you're talking about here, like with Epstein, space lasers, QAnon, sex cults, liberal sex cults at the top or whatever, like, you know, so many of these books, even over the past 50 years even, that are arguing similar types of conspiracies, are basing the arguments on evidence that's just not true. I mean, like, but it's evidence that's like, it has an affective impulse though, and like an affective impulse. And I talk a bit about this in the book. To me, I think the book is itself in some ways a book about what counts as evidence, because you have people who believe in possession and you could show them things, including the Exorcist movie, which is not real. And you could show them that and they could go see it's real. You and I would look at that and go, that's terrible evidence. But for some people, it's like, because it triggers an emotional register, suddenly now it's believable. And I think about this with, like, kind of brought up the UFO thing again, but I think it's worth mentioning. It's kind of the same thing with that. There's so much writing out there on this. It almost is real because there is so much written on it, you know? So I think there's something there too, like about the line being completely fuzzy when it comes to the books like Marx and Satan and then reality, you know, or QAnon, or what somebody says on Twitter, or some conspiratorial, just insane thing, and then what's really going on. And I think if you have people who are primed to accept something incredible like that because it triggers something emotionally within them, and it's kind of like anything is possible in this very confusing world, they're likely going to believe some of the stuff that you and I are looking at like, this is insane, because we kind of have built this sort of, we have a capitalist critique in our back pocket a little bit, you know, like as materialists, like I think about, like, in Naomi Klein's book, Doppelganger, when she's like, the big difference between me and my doppelganger is, like, I have this capitalist critique there that isn't present there. It's like, you could talk about all these issues, but until you kind of mention the fact that there's like labor and supply and demand and exploitation, then it's not totally borne out. And so some of these conspiracies are like incredibly insane to us because it doesn't take into consideration the role of capitalism, which, again, to quote Naomi Klein in a different book, she's like, there is no conspiracy needed. It's just the way capitalism works, guys. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd actually also like to talk about the extended analogy of spirit possession, exorcism, and just purification rituals in general. Now that perhaps in some sense, the specter of communism as it was understood and felt in the post-Soviet era may be different now. I mean, these days, of course, with the emergence of online cultures, and maybe it's a kind of availability bias on my part, but it seems like socialist narratives, anarchist, communist narratives are a little bit more front and center than they used to be. It's hard to maneuver in an online space or a sort of delimited zone. Even if your algorithm tends towards MAGA and Trump stuff, you're going to encounter people who have those kinds of beliefs, not to mention the general growth of queer culture as well. And in some ways, what once typified exorcism and those sorts of purification rituals have now been transmogrified into things like conversion therapy. But you also talk about in the book cult deprogramming and, for example, soldiers coming back from foreign wars and making sure that they did not bring back with them the taint of communism or what have you. But here we have this new frontier, especially as it relates to, queer youth in particular, and trans folks in particular, where we have states where the laws against conversion therapy were reversed and now it's being embraced again. But how do you see this analogy playing out historically in modern times? What are the frontiers of the purification rituals and their political targets these days? And how do you address that in the book?
Yeah, the connection between conversion efforts. When you read about, I got all these books from all these not self-published, but these evangelical publishers
Tracts.
who are, yeah,
like chick publication kind of books.
Yeah. And so many of them, I got plenty of them, and written by evangelicals or people with no credentials whatsoever, writing about conversion efforts. And when you read the description of what they endorse, these quote unquote rituals, conversion quote unquote therapy, when you read about them, there's not a whole lot of difference between what they're describing and something like a good old fashioned exorcism that we might see in dramatized in a Hollywood film or something. In fact, plenty of these conversion therapies in practice are themselves kind of very violent, extreme exorcisms, or they could be very minor type prayer type, deliverance type exorcisms. But there's still the ultimate goal here is to kind of address whatever it is that is believed to have taken over a person. And some of these writers think it's a trans ideology or the demon of homosexuality or whatever. And that quote unquote demon is addressed in order to be purged. And then the person, like you say, can be purified and be restored to their normal self in the eyes of the people around them. And you do have people who willingly consent to undergo these types of rituals, but it's not always the case. Just like with any exorcism, you have plenty of people who are, again, sort of kidnapped into the performance against their will. And yeah, this has an enormous mental toll on people, and people are harmed, or adolescents and minors who are essentially placed within these rituals without their consent. And it causes a lot of damage and a lot of trauma. Deprogramming is another one of these terms that comes up in the 1970s. It's mainly referred to in terms of cult, quote unquote, brainwashing. So what we have here are a number of different metaphors, the definitions of which are kind of blurry and they all sort of bleed together. They're kind of variants on the same theme, if you will. The ultimate theme is to try to essentially reduce a person's behavior and belief down to an ideology, pathologize that ideology as it's not really them, it's just this mind virus or this demon or this spirit or this ideology or whatever, this belief, it's gotten a hold of them. And what we have to do is get the ideology out of them, whether that's through tactics that look like prayer or tactics that look like torture, and so that they can be returned to their rightful self. And to some extent, these practices all kind of deprogramming. The term itself was being compared to exorcism in the 1970s by scholars of people who were studying cults and deprogramming at that time and brainwashing or whatever. But it has sort of maybe a technical ring to it. Deprogramming sounds very different from exorcism. The same thing with conversion therapy. The fact that it has the word therapy in the title is meant to sort of frame itself as something that's for the good of the person and is medical in some way, procedural. But all of them kind of have fuzzy boundaries in terms of what they define. And they all, in some way or another, can resemble exorcism in practice. And certainly when they're being talked about, I have one of these books on my shelf, The Case for Conversion Therapy. And when you read that book, it really is essentially they're using religious language like possession and exorcism to talk about something that to them a quasi-medical type procedure.
Yeah, I guess maybe to put a finer point on my question, it seems as if we look at it historically, genealogically, maybe we can even use that term here, that there's almost a form to the purification ritual. It's a kind of non-discursive rite that's rite, R-I-T-E, that's employed as a way to mitigate certain forms of cultural deviation and to keep a lock on certain norms within a culture. And of course, we see it has a spiritual accent maybe in the late 19th century. And then, of course, when it comes to conversion efforts, as you're saying here, there may be a religious dimension to it if we're looking at it from a reactionary standpoint, but also just a generally socially conservative aspect to it as well. And I just find it profoundly interesting that it does take a kind of amorphous form. There's a kind of Right. There's a procedure, there's a ritual, there's the establishment of an authority role within it, whether that's the priest or whether that's the therapist. I mean, clearly there's a kind of like Foucauldian reading of this just waiting right there for us if we wanted it. But I was curious as to whether or not from this abstract form of the purification ritual, if you were able to extract a kind of logic of it and like, how do we think this further? And maybe we've already answered that question with respect to the political horizon that we are at here today, but how is it that then we can stave off those dangers? And like, what is the antidote, as it were, to being caught within the apparatus of exorcism? Whether that means like, how does one find gender expression adequate to the individual in today's society without being caught in the apparatus of conversion efforts, for example? Right. And one, if you were in the 18th or 19th century, how would one express one's deepest emotional core or express that which has been suppressed, the values which have been suppressed by one society, even if that means meeting in a secret witches' coven at the top of the hill or something like that? It seems as if, you know, between the scapegoating tendencies of the exorcists, and there's a kind of polarizing effect where the line of flight from that is maybe and sometimes doubling down on the identity and moving further with it, right? Yeah, fuck it, I am a witch, you know, and I do witchy stuff. There you have it. But I just find it interesting to see those parallels almost transhistorically.
Yeah. Yeah, and in so many of the cases in the 1970s when you had, you know, young adults, sometimes in their early 20s, who were joining cults and just essentially doing it on kind of like some of them moved into compounds, some of them didn't, but they would join cults and they would wear the robes and chant the stuff or whatever. And sometimes their parents would get super freaked out and they would kidnap them for deprogramming. I go into that in the book. And for many of them, their strategy was to get me out of the apparatus, to get me out of the teeth of this monster. They would renounce their cult membership. They would say, all right, thank you for the deprogramming. This worked. I'm no longer going to be a part of the cult that's taking my money. And they would like parrot back everything the deprogrammer / exorcist would want to hear. And then they would be set free. And everybody involved would go, oh, like my child, who is, again, many of them over the age of 18, so they're legal adults. But they're like, oh my gosh, my kids, they're back to normal. And then for many of them, they would be let free and then they would just go rejoin the cult. And again, yeah, as you say, kind of double down and do their thing. And for many of them, they did the cult thing for a while and then moved on. We could certainly talk a lot about the cults and how they tend to, there tends to be a pejorative association with the word cult. Obviously, there's good reason for that, but plenty of cults in the 1970s as today operated kind of like no differently than a church, but still freaked a lot of people out. But anyway, so yeah, they would do this sort of thing where they would have to lie to get out of it and then would just go right back to doing the cult thing and being like, yeah, this is who I am, get over it. But yeah, I mean, you're talking about this purification. I think of it kind of like a script, if you will, that sort of, it's like a purification script that changes over time and sometimes even by the decade. And I do think that what we're dealing with here when we're talking about conversion efforts, conversion therapy, deprogramming, even deliverance, and even maybe the way we think about exorcism today is so shaped by some of the dramatic detailings of exorcisms in literature and in film for the past 50 to 70 years that it can be hard to even like put yourself in an imaginative state about what a person would be like undergoing exorcism in, let's say, the early modern period. Because in early modern Europe, you had plenty of people who were consenting to exorcism because they thought this is what would heal me. Ultimately, I've got something going on and whatever. Then you had plenty of people in the early modern period who faked it, and they had coaches to help them out. They would learn how to vomit things up on command and how to talk in a certain voice and do all these acrobatics for money and for fame. And so it doesn't explain all the cases back then, but in some way, yes, you did have people who were like, and honestly, I think this goes outside the scope of the book, but like looking at the history of the witch hunt is like a perfect example of this kind of thing, where it's like, how in the world do you sort of get out of what is essentially state-sponsored terrorism toward women? And today, I don't know. I mean, I think that I'm a rhetoric and communication person, so I think a lot about the language that's used and how that sort of creates real life practices. And I do think that the more that people resort to using possession and exorcism as accusation and metaphor, the more it becomes in the public's mind kind of like a usable or possible tool to make things right on the ground. I write a lot about Malachi Martin in the book, and like Malachi Martin, who wrote Hostage to the Devil in the late 1970s, his whole thing was very much about being on the ground troops combating not the devil that would drop the atomic bombs, but the devil that gets inside people and turns them gay or trans or turns them into a person that might be a liberal or whatever. And I do think that he was able to do that because these were such handy metaphors at the time, and they still are, that when he was able to talk about a person who is transgender in the book and basically alleging that they were in fact possessed, you had plenty of people who read that believing that it was true. And next thing, the book is a bestseller. So I do think that this is in some ways like a rhetorical or a language problem that has like downstream real world effects.
I know we've spoken a lot about who gets possessed and who gets exorcisms conducted upon them, but I want to ask you a question about who doesn't get an exorcism done upon them, which technically is most people. What I really mean is about if you seek an exorcism for someone else, then there is the implicit admission that they can be depossessed or they can be repossessed by their original role within the social structure. And insofar as you've been looking at all of these narratives and histories of exorcism and possession, how, in your experience, do these narratives deal with the convertible? Because, for example, you look at the history of colonialism, Muslims in North Africa were not allowed to convert to Christianity. If they did, they were still called Catholic Muslims. There was this category made by colonialism of the unconvertible in a similar way that you couldn't necessarily convert between races in the racial schema unless the schema itself changed. Have you encountered in your history of these narratives any example of something that happens to someone who is seen as possessed but not offered something like an exorcism? Is it the case that they are sort of left in a sort of condemned phase, or do they become the demons? Because even thinking about, for example, like Trump isn't describing the mass arrest and deportation and indeed sterilization, as we're seeing now, of a lot of Hispanic citizens and Hispanic residents of the USA as an exorcism. It's just purgation. There's not a convertibility there. He's not going to say that we can convert you to being white, essentially. How does exorcism as a narrative, is it in a way haunted by the spectre of the unexercisable, the unconvertible, the person who you can't bring to the oath because you're not recognizing them as part of the oath, the social contract? Is exorcism always a narrative that basically always applies to an in-group that has become converted to something else and they want to convert them back? Or I'm thinking a lot about one of the narratives, or the main, might mean a slogan you hear a lot from a lot of trans comrades is death before detransition. It's like saying, I'm going to become inconvertible and you can fucking try it, sort of thing.
Yeah, that's a great question, because so many of these proponents of exorcisms, especially the right-wing reactionary folks who are using exorcism as this weapon to target minorities and marginalized folks, the promise that they make tends to be, if we can dispossess you and purge the alien ideology or whatever it is that's inside of you, you will be like us and you'll be able to join our ranks or whatever. The thing is, though, what so many of them, especially post-Manson, as we move into the late 1970s, endorse, like folks like Malachi Martin, for example, what they endorsed was this idea that if you are a person who's possessed and we are going to be kind enough to give you exorcism to get rid of that for you, the idea is that you must have done something to open yourself up in a vulnerable way to possession and to spirits. I think that idea is still very much around today. Right-wing opinion that like people are ultimately in charge of themselves, because that was kind of the first concern when brainwashing became a word, like right at the start of the Cold War. It became this problem. Like, how can we as American citizens who are strong and fortitudinous or whatever, how is it that we can be brainwashed by the evil Soviets? Well, it's not because we're weak or something. That would be quite anti-American. Instead, it's that we are in charge of our own actions and we must have done something to dabble and open that door up. And so it could be anything like Craig said, like Dungeons and Dragons or heavy metal music. Or today it could be like I scrolled too much on my phone and now I am questioning my gender identity or whatever. Or I had a drag performer come and read to me as a young child in a classroom in Knoxville, Tennessee, and now I'm not straight anymore and my parents are upset or whatnot. So there is this whole like personal responsibility narrative. And I do think that like when these people are perhaps undergo deprogramming or exorcism and the idea is that they no longer have or no longer are possessed by that thing, there's still this like, okay, we've converted you back, but also we have to monitor you to make sure that you're not going to do it again, because ultimately you can't really be trusted. This kind of thing showed up time and again during the cult deprogramming panic of the 1970s. In fact, they had a term for it. They called it floating, that after a person who had joined a quote unquote left-wing cult or anti-Christian cult or whatever, that once they'd undergone deprogramming, they seemed to be better. Then they had to be kind of surveilled or whatever, and they had to be policed in some way so that they wouldn't rejoin the cult or slip back into it. And so to answer your question about the unconvertible, the thing is like, I do think that there's suddenly like this stigma that gets attached, like maybe not so much to Reagan McNeil and The Exorcist, if we ignore The Exorcist 2 for a minute, but like if we were to like kind of like see past the end of the movie, it's like, to what extent is she monitored because it was her fault and can never truly join the ranks of the have never been possessed? I don't really know, but I do think that it's like there is this sort of like, you have your own responsibility to protect yourself. And we could purge you of the devil, but ultimately it was your fault. And so, yeah.
That's really interesting that you bring that up about personal responsibility, because like I said, I had various friends who had parents who were involved in various churches, evangelical, Jehovah's Witnesses, Methodists, all kinds of people. And I had one friend in particular whose father basically had like a mega church. And so I'd go there from time to time, whether just to go hang out or pick my brother up or something like that. And there was a particular instance in which I was just in the church and watching a sermon being delivered by a young pastor. This was probably around 2010 or something like that. But it was interesting to hear inflections of sort of like Fox News talking points kind of suffuse the sermon. Like, you need to take on responsibility for yourself. That's what it means to be a Christian, not just lazing about, like getting your stuff done. If that means getting your resume together, you got to do it. And then in the next breath, there's people falling on the floor because they're possessed by the Spirit. So there's this weird double bind between enforcing a kind of personal responsibility and agency, but then in the next minute being completely overcome by this numinous power in the command of the pastor, who was probably like 22 at the time. But just an interesting observation that I don't have any sort of extended analysis of, but it ties exactly into what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's true. And Craig, it's so funny because I had something happen like that to me as well. Maybe a couple years after that, I was filling in for a friend of mine who plays the drums for this church. And it had been a long time since I'd been in a kind of a Southern Baptist congregation. And yeah, I mean, it was like I was watching Fox News basically, because at the end of the day, there's that dovetail there of personal responsibility. You're in control of your own actions. You screw up, you're going to invite the devil in. You don't screw up, you're going to be like us. You're going to walk the straight and narrow and all of this. And the crazy thing is too, is like some of the readings that I did on the cults of the 1970s, you had some parents who were even a little freaked out about their adult children falling over a little too much in the Spirit. Yeah. There is still like there's like a room in that world to fall over and become self-possessed by the Spirit, but you could test that boundary. You do it a little too much or a little too whatever. Now you're like a quote-unquote Jesus freak, and we might calm it down a little bit. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, because my brother and my sister went to this one church in particular. And so I would get the overflow conversations and the drama without being there. And one of the things that the community is trained to do is sort of police each other in terms of like, hey, never really saw you put your hands up, you know? And then if you do it too much, right, you're out then too. So there's like this healthy threshold.
Yes. I mean, when you say the straight and narrow, I mean, it is like truly, there is just and it can also, I mean, it's like the rules kind of change all the time a little bit. There's also like, again, not to be a rhetorical person, but there's also like an ethos element there. It's like that guy is like, he's a good Christian guy in the community. He's a good looking guy or whatever. And so he can really throw his hands up and fall down in the Spirit, and that's okay. But this person over here, maybe not so much. I mean, it really is like shifting targets and rules. And I tell you, you see this when writing this book, is like, it's a pick and choose ideology.
Yeah, I'm almost getting triggered by this conversation. But
I
anyway,
love
Adam,
Protestantism. I love Protestantism because it's like, yeah, you're not in good enough standing with the community. You can't be graced by the Holy Spirit. God does not give grace to sinners. That's not what Christianity is about. No, you are not being forgiven. That guy nailed to a bit of wood up there in between two thieves and one insurrectionist. Yeah, no, he didn't forgive them. He fucking hated those guys. He went, it's like, I love American Christianity. It's like they got confused at some point who they were worshipping. It's like, no, the guy that tortures everyone and gives everyone mental illness forever. No, that's the guy we're big on. This is John Calvin and his consequences have been a disaster for the human race. Let's just say it there.
Listen, they are confused. Even the mega churches. Have you ever been in a true mega church? It's like, Craig, I know you have. Like, I mean, it is like, okay, I would be. Who are we praying to right now? This is confusing. I'm like at a Coldplay concert.
Oh yeah, like when the bass guitarist has a fuzz pedal and everything too. It's like, all right, this is crazy, man. Well, hey, let's take this conversation back behind the Patreon paywall. See if that's the real devil there. But yeah, no, I'd love to talk with you more just about writing this book in general. And I think it was in the preface. Was it Tariq who said to you, be careful of what forces you unleash? That sounds
I read it in his voice.
Yeah, I read it in his voice too.
Be careful, Grafton. You don't know what forces you might unleash with this book.
It was him.
He does write amazing possession stories. Did you read any when he was putting this book together?
Yeah.
The Picture of Contented New Wealth.
Yes.
The one where his wife... So I say, the lead characters, some of Tarek's books do tend to be very flavoured, but like the one where his wife gets possessed by a thesis on Deleuze and Guattari's theory of demons, which I'm like, oh damn, that was the book that we wrote for Rapia. Like,
exactly.
So at this point, we invite you to continue the conversation with us on our Patreon account, where you can subscribe for just $5. That will get you access to other exclusive interviews, extended discussions, and it will allow you to partake in our ongoing reading groups and those coming down the pike in 2026. Just navigate to the show notes, find our Patreon account, and we will see you there.